want to get your take on Russia before we get you out of here. And of course, overnight we saw the Russian Ministry of Defense make moves to remove Russian forces from the city of Kherson. And we predicted last night on the show that immediately there was going to be Western jubilation that this was a Russian retreat. And sure enough, they didn't disappoint almost immediately. President Biden said that Vladimir Putin is pulling troops out of Fallujah, which of course is not in Ukraine. But nevertheless, he meant Kherson. And so there was this jubilation among the mainstream media about removal from Kherson. This is a clear sign, of course, that that Russia is now losing. And I just want to get your sense of what this means, what this portends for ground freezing over the next few weeks. What is Russia doing here by this move?
When General Surovikin took command, he is the new theater commander. In other words, the equivalent of, say, Schwarzkopf or Tommy Franks in CENTCOM. He is now the Western theater commander for everything that happens in and around Ukraine. And when he took command, there were certain agreements that were made and new decisions from President Putin. Number one, we are going to prepare for a decisive operation to end the war. In other words, no more simply defend southern Ukraine and the territory that we've annexed. No more expectation of serious negotiations with anybody. Those are over. We have to now end the war. How do you end the war? Well, you launch offensive operations that are so devastating in their power and destructiveness that the enemy cannot resist them. However, if you're going to do that, you have to scale back current activities. In other words, you've got to make some changes on the ground, shuffle troops, change resource commitments, because you are now building up forces that are not in southern Ukraine, except for some are there, but most are not, that are being prepared with this mobilization force of 300,000 integrated into this new force for these future offensive operations, which I've talked about before, which others have mentioned, which will come this winter once the ground freezes. Now, it hasn't gone below 37 degrees at night in Ukraine, and it's got to drop below freezing significantly and stay there for the ground to freeze. So it's not going to happen until that is done. Now, in Kherson, they had about 25,000 troops sitting in Kherson City. The Ukrainians were trying to assemble 40 to 60,000 to attack it. And there was a debate. Well, can we defend it? Yeah, we can probably defend it, but is it worth it? And what are we going to do about the Russians that live in Kherson? Remember, we're operating in an area where the people that live in that part of Ukraine are Russians.
Right.
So they said, no, that's going to be very difficult. So they said, no, let's withdraw the civilians. And so for the last several weeks, you've seen the movement of civilians in Kherson out.
Right.
Once that withdrawal,
I think it was like 115,000 civilians out of Kherson over the past 3 weeks.
I don't know, but virtually the whole population has left. And some of the people being interviewed on the way out said that, yes, the shelling from the Ukrainian side was becoming increasingly severe and intense. So, yeah, we probably should leave. The 25,000 troops that were there were well prepared to defend it, but they said, no, let's not do that. Let's pull them across and redistribute those assets elsewhere. A lot of these soldiers that are in southern Ukraine, about 70,000 to 80,000 of them, have been fighting for several months. There's an interest in giving them some rest and refitting them for the future offensive. So pulling these 25,000 troops made operational sense. Now, strategically, Putin's not concerned about what we in the West think, but I think he is concerned about what's happening in Russia. And the average Russian on the street is extremely upset. He takes the position that this is Russia, Russian territory. We should be moving forward. We need to liberate Odessa. We need to liberate Kharkov. These are Russian cities. That's what we need to do. Why are we falling back? And they've tried to explain that this is not a sudden decision. This was carefully considered. The priority right now is to consolidate control over what we have. Let's not take any unnecessary casualties. And if the enemy goes into Kherson in great numbers, guess what? The entire place is carefully targeted for annihilation. In fact, the southern Ukrainian command made an announcement that they were concerned that perhaps this was a trap. that if they go in great numbers into Kherson, that the Russians will in fact concentrate their striking power, rockets, missiles, artillery, in great quantity and kill everything that goes into Kherson because there are no Russians living there now. So the Ukrainians aren't stupid. They're actually onto something. They understand that this could be very dangerous for them to move in there in great numbers. So I think eventually the Russian population will calm down, but right now they're angry. They're angry with Putin. They're angry with Surovikin. They're angry with the Russian military. They don't understand why anything is being given up. But remember, they made a similar decision with Kharkov. They said, it's not worth holding, pull out, pull back to the river. And that's what they've done. It hasn't hurt them militarily. And in fact, they were able to inflict a lot of damage on the Ukrainians who subsequently poured in there. So I think if we see the Ukrainians go in any strength into Kherson, we will watch as they are annihilated. And they can do it now because there aren't any civilians in the way. So I would regard this as an operational decision with short-term benefit in support of the long-term strategy of building this enormous offensive striking power. I also think that's why the administration has now privately approached the Russians to talk to them. Because I think people in Washington, as well as in London, because those are the two hubs for all the intelligence with CIA and MI6, they know what's coming. And there are roughly 250 to 300,000 combat troops, plus another 200,000 or 300,000 in support in Belarusia, in Western Russia, on the western side of Ukraine, and building up south of the lines in southern Ukraine. So you have what looks like the potential for 3 operational axes. Now, how this will all come together and when it will happen, we think it depends on the weather, but they're pretty close to being ready. So that once the ground freezes, whenever that is, I think we'll see this begin. Because again, they no longer place any trust or confidence in negotiations. I don't think we can say anything to the Russians at this point that will persuade them to stop, which we've effectively tried to do. I think we've said, look, we don't want you to do this. And that goes back to this so-called coalition of the willing,
right,
that they've been trying to build. That will use the coalition of the willing. I don't think the Russians care. I think the Russians will say, fine, if they get in the way, they're going to be destroyed. It's unfortunate, but I think that's where we are now.
I think you're right. And I think that's a very astute assessment of what's going on here. Maybe politically, it's not the greatest move, but at the end of the day, it doesn't seem they really care politically. Right now, it seems it was a very smart military move to both save troops and armament, save material, and reposition.
Yeah, there's one thing, if I could say it, that it might make it clear to people. During the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, when the Germans attacked, initially, there were orders that went out, dig in. Fight, don't move, don't fall back. And in fact, we had a large armored force that was transferred from 3rd Army north to fight under Ridgway, who was a corps commander in the 18th Airborne Corps against the Germans. And he gave the instructions to this armored force under a general named Bruce Clark, who became a 4-star after the war and became very famous as a result of this incident. But he told Bruce Clark, I want you to take your men and your tanks and your artillery. I want you to dig everything in and fight for 2 days. So he looked, he said, yes, okay, fine. He went up there. He didn't do it. And instead, he fought for 5 days and he conducted a fighting withdrawal. In other words, he fell back in front of the Germans. He ran the Germans out of fuel. Ridgway was furious and said he was a coward and wanted to relieve him. Field Marshal Montgomery intervened. He said, no, he's doing exactly the right thing. Run the Germans out of fuel. They don't have enough fuel. Let them extend themselves. They did. And of course, we know the rest of the story.
Well, and you're right about we've seen reports over the past 24 hours of the Russians using inflatable tanks to try to exhaust Ukrainian munitions. Right.
Of course.
So they're trying to starve them out. So really, really fascinating. I think you're absolutely right about that. Colonel, always great to see you. We thank you for your analysis here. We'll be watching this very closely. If we don't get to talk to you beforehand, and hopefully we won't, maybe we'll have a peaceful Thanksgiving. And then that's the hope, I hope. Colonel, great to see you, and much love to you and your family.
Thanks very much. Same to you.